Oh, hello, Jess. Thanks for joining us.
Hey all,
Hello.
how's it going?
Very good. Yeah. Yeah. So we already have it recording. So I guess we'll just start. Let's go. So hello all and welcome. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Miss Jessica Scarane, current challenger for Delaware Senate seat. And yeah, thanks for taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us tonight. My name is Anthony. I'm joined by Rachel and Isabel. We'll also be asking questions. There might be a couple other students joining in as we do this, but the recording will be released to a larger audience tomorrow at 7. Yeah, so we're excited to be doing this, and let's just start out with some quick intros of the people who are asking questions. So my name is Anthony. I'm a junior majoring in Geographic Information Sciences, and I'm with Sunrise UD. And as Rachel, you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a senior marine science and biology major, and I'm the co-president of the Earth, Ocean, and Environment Club.
Hi, I'm Isabel. I am a senior pre-vet major with a minor in wildlife conservation, and I am the other co-president for Earth, Ocean, and Environment Club.
All right. So the discussion tonight will be focused on environmental policy and plans to make both Delaware and our country more sustainable. So some of the questions will have a follow-up question, and Jess, you'll be able to take as much time as you'd like to respond to them. And so, yeah, this discussion is being hosted by Earth, Ocean, and Environment Club and Sunrise UD. Both are organizations at University of Delaware. So before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge for our viewers that this discussion is not an endorsement for the Delaware Senate seat because Senator Chris Coons was not available to participate in a debate. And before we get started, Ms. Green, do you have any questions before we get started?
No, I'm all good.
All right, and let's begin with our first question. So, Ms. Scarane, you're a supporter of the Green New Deal. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a supporter of the Green New Deal because I believe that we need to end our dependence on fossil fuel and provide a just transition to 100% renewable energy. I support the Green New Deal because it provides a path forward on several of the most pressing issues that we are facing as a country, from racist and classist environmental degradation, a stagnant economy, far too many people who are out of work, unaffordable public transit and utilities, and also a imperialist domestic and foreign policy. And the Green New Deal really does tackle many of these issues that are incredibly important, and I see as the largest foreign policy and existential crisis facing our country right now. So I believe that we need to achieve total divestment from fossil fuels by the year 2030, which is what climate scientists have told us. I think anyone who is looking at divestment at a later year, a lot of people are talking about 2050. They are ignoring the timelines that have been set forth by scientists. And I think that we have to support an aggressive investment in renewable energy sources. I absolutely believe we need to end federal subsidies that are propping up the fossil fuel industry currently. This is incredibly important for the state of Delaware. It's the lowest lying state in the country, and we have thousands of residents who are at risk of being displaced by rising sea levels and inland flooding and coastal flooding as a result of climate change. And we need leaders who see that as the existential crisis that it is for our state, who aren't compromising the lives and future of our residents in our state. And I believe that it is an important tool in revitalizing our economy and actually realizing human dignity. Providing a federal jobs guarantee and work benefits to everyone who is currently employed in the fossil fuel industry. If we allow the fossil fuel industry to crash out, the workers are going to get nothing. They will protect shareholders, they will protect executives, and workers will be left with nothing. So it's incredibly important that we guarantee salaries and transition for the people who are working in the fossil fuel industry right now, and ensure that the jobs that are created through a Green New Deal actually benefit the communities that are most impacted by climate change, as well as environmental racism and degradation and the pollution that we have seen in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods throughout our state and our country as well. So that is why I support a Green New Deal. I think we have to support candidates who will fight for it and fight to enact it and see through the divestment of our country from fossil fuels.
Thank you for that. And so as a follow-up question to that, unfortunately, just last year, the Green New Deal suffered a massive defeat in the Senate. So barring a massive change in Senate ideology, how would you work with senators who didn't support the Green New Deal last time?
Yeah, I think this really comes down to using the power of a Senate seat differently than we have seen. And it's something I've talked about in a few ways, but I come to this seat with a background of being an activist and an advocate. And I see that as incredibly important, as using the power of a platform that a Senate seat gives you to organize the people and drive their energy and their action, specifically at potentially other members of Congress or the Senate who are not supportive of the actions that we need to take. I mean, we know in the state of Delaware, the Green New Deal has incredibly high support. I think we've seen numbers above 60% approving taking this action. But we don't see that represented in the representatives who we have. They are refusing to side with what the people are demanding. And I think that exists in a lot of states throughout the country. So using the power of a Senate seat to actually organize people and drive direct actions that they can take to try to influence other senators, or if we don't believe those senators can be influenced, to get them out of office, because we really are on a timeline where we cannot wait for people to come around. We need to force the hand of people who are in office, or we need to force them out.
Sorry. So the Green New Deal calls for the creation of government jobs to combat climate change, build infrastructure, and promote the spread of clean energy. So how would you assure that some of these newly created jobs would go to the state of Delaware?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there is quite a bit of work to do in the state of Delaware. When we think about the fact that we are already suffering from things that are driven by climate change, by rising sea levels, we are already seeing we're losing farmland to saltwater intrusion. We are on track to be a state that will have to import drinking water within 100 years because of what is happening to our water supply here. So we have to make sure that there's work done directly in our state. I think so. We need to focus on redoing all of the infrastructure of our water system as a whole. Those should be jobs that go to Delawareans, absolutely. And they should be jobs that go to Delawareans who come from communities that have suffered the most from pollution or environmental degradation that has happened in our state. So you have to start there. You have to start by recruiting from those places and going directly to those people and offering those jobs to them. I think that is something that I've even learned in my work that I do in my day job, is that when you are recruiting for jobs, you cannot sit back and simply look for the people who come to you. You have to go find the people who can fill those jobs. And you need to expand the base of recruiting so that you reach out to people who may not otherwise have the same connections to get a job. Because if you are always recruiting from the same pool of people, you're always excluding the same pool of people as well. So I think it's incredibly important that we actually, when we have those jobs, we go into the communities that have been most harmed and do recruiting there first. And ensuring that we give those jobs first to people who have suffered the most. So there are things we absolutely need to do. It's investing in public transportation in our state. It's reworking the piping that delivers water to our homes, because even when we get clean water out of our water processing plants, often the pipes that it is running through are damaging that water and making it unsafe to drink. So we need to replace that piping. We also need to invest in high-speed internet in our state and the infrastructure to deliver high-speed internet to every single house in our state. That is a huge gap that we are facing right now, particularly for people in Southern Delaware and Western Delaware, where there's just not even a provider who can provide them high-speed internet. And that leads to some of the gaps that we even saw this spring with students trying to do schoolwork from home and being completely unable to do it because they don't have connectivity in their home. So these are all things that we absolutely have to ensure are part of the plan to invest in Delaware.
So you mentioned that Delaware is susceptible to sea level rise. Since it is a low-lying state, how will you protect Delaware from sea level rise? And how will you prevent property from being sold at high-risk areas that experience salination and erosion?
Yeah, so this really comes into that point of the work that we have to do to invest in buildings to protect them as well as land. I mean, I think we are already experiencing that sea level rise, right? There's a level of it that we know we are not going to stop. We have to address that head on, and we cannot say that these things are not going to affect us or these things are not going to get worse. We have to take the steps to prevent them from seeing the worst catastrophes, and we have to take the steps in parallel to protect ourselves against it. So that is really about making the investment to either lift homes that need to be lifted or buildings that need to be lifted, to do the replenishment that's necessary if that's what's necessary, to create buildings that are not are feeding into the problem. There's far too many homes and buildings that are major contributors to the energy usage that we see. We need to outfit those buildings to ensure that they are greener and doing less harm. And we have to particularly make sure that things like roadways are lifted out of the floodplain as it continues to increase and raise, because we already have roads, particularly downstate and particularly in southern Wilmington, that flood, honestly, if we just get a little bit of rain, or in some cases downstate when there's just high tides. So we know the things that we're facing already. We have to invest in protecting by anticipating the change that we know that's going to come and getting things out of harm's way, either through rebuilding roads, lifting homes, and outfitting them to ensure that they are able to withstand the effects that we're going to see.
Great. So along those lines, climate refugees are likely to become a larger and larger problem in the near future. How would you address this problem?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think we have to think about that not only as people from other countries. I think that's where people often go when they hear that phrase. But we're looking at, in the state of Delaware, our summers might start to look like the summers that are currently in San Antonio. So what are the summers in San Antonio going to start looking like? And they're going to be really inhabitable places even within our own country, as well as neighboring countries that are uninhabitable. And we have to recognize that our country's reliance on fossil fuels has driven a lot of this historical climate catastrophe effects abroad and in our own country. And as those effects worsen, the number of climate refugees, as you state, will absolutely rise dramatically. And even locally, we're going to see as coastal flooding increases, people will displace people who live at those beaches, residents who live along those waterways. So we need to fight to pass legislation that enacts immigration reform and actually allows people to come here more easily and creates a far more welcoming immigration system. And we have to raise the cap on refugees admitted to this country to ensure that the harm that, frankly, we have caused throughout the globe, through historically, we can repair by allowing people to come into our country. And we have to expand funding to support refugees, climate refugees, who are both within our own borders as well as coming from foreign borders, who are fleeing the impacts of climate change, and actually support them, and to ensure that they can find housing. And this is in part why I support things like guaranteed housing and a federal jobs guarantee, to ensure that anyone who comes and needs housing and work can find it, and that we guarantee that people are not falling between the cracks and are actually taken care of in this country.
So the University of Delaware currently buys its power from the city of Newark. It is very unlikely that UD will switch to solar or wind power despite UD having its own wind turbine. How would you help implement green energy in the state of Delaware?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sourcing of our power is the major issue, right? One thing that really resonated with me was that when a lot of businesses shut down and people were no longer, say, commuting to jobs when we had a lockdown for the pandemic, we only chipped off about like 15% of our normal energy usage. and buildings and homes were still using a very large amount of energy, particularly in some cases, homes were using more than they had been. And that is a real important thing to think about, because it reminds us that while our transportation system is a huge contributor to the issues of climate change and of emissions, it's also the homes and the buildings that we live in and where that energy comes from. And we talk a lot about how people who are moving to, say, electric cars or making their homes run so more efficiently, when you put energy into that home or into that car that is still coming from a dirty source, you're not actually solving the problem. So we absolutely have to divest from fossil fuels. We can start by ending the fossil fuel subsidies that we spend to prop up these companies. We can start by instead shifting that exact money into supporting the renewable resources that we need and replacing the inputs into the grid with renewable energy resources. So I think that we really have to think about this as a systemic issue and a more holistic issue. And it cannot just be individuals or even institutions individually deciding that we are going to change the source of our energy, because that just will not get us there. It's good if I make my house run more efficiently, but it's good if my entire neighborhood does that, or my entire city, or my entire state, but it's still not enough to really undo the effects that we are seeing and to truly change the system. So it really has to be more about, from a federal government standpoint, we disallow fossil fuel development. We shut down any new drilling or extraction, and we move toward investing the funds and our public money into those renewable resources, because I don't think we can rely on individual institutions to get the change that we need.
Along these lines, a couple of wind farms have targeted locations off of the Rehoboth Beach area to insert wind turbines. What would you say to the residents of Sussex County that think of the wind turbines as eyesores, or, not part of the natural scenery?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to really think about what that natural scenery is going to look like without changing our energy resources. I mean, we're going to see a whole lot of storms hitting those shorelines, much more severe storms. We're going to see the shorelines inch further and further inland as they continue to be damaged and washed away. I know that there was some study done this spring and summer that asked people sort of visually, like, if the wind turbines are set this many miles offshore, how do you feel about it? How do you feel about it? And they actually gave them sort of a visual reference for it. And once people saw that, they seemed to support it more. So I think that we have to do more actions like that to help people have a better concept of what this will actually look like, what it will really mean for their view. Because I think people have an idea of what a few miles off the shore looks like, but they don't, when they see it actually depicted properly and shown, they come around, I think, to recognize that it's not as close as maybe they thought it would be. And I think it really has to come from the standpoint of what are the other effects? Because we're at a point where we cannot choose to not act, and we cannot allow the change that's going to come to just overrun us. We absolutely have to grab this by the reins and decide what that change is going to look like and what our future is going to look like. And that is the kind of angle I think we need to take, is more about giving really clear and correct information to people and helping them realize that they're not going to have that beachfront property or that view if we don't take action and change the sources of our energy in our energy system.
How will you work with DENREC and DENIR to implement environmental stewardship programs?
Say that last part again, sorry.
Oh, sorry, to implement environmental stewardship programs.
Well, I think that what we have to do is push those organizations to be really focused on the regulation that they should be doing. I think that I've heard quite a few people, and particularly if you remember the spill that happened, the gas leak that happened at the Crota plant up here in Newcastle County, it shut down the Delaware Memorial Bridge. It caused a spill of hundreds of thousands of gallons of water that was contaminated, that was used to prevent the plant from exploding, that then overran their the pools that were supposed to catch it and ran into our water and land. And there's a real feeling from particularly the people who live near that plant that, one, DNREC did not provide them with nearly enough information, and two, that the fines that were levied against Crota were not nearly enough to really undo the damage that it caused. And I think that is where we really have to focus, is these regulatory agencies have to take that very seriously. And we have to be not, when things happen, we have to ensure that we actually hold corporations accountable for the damage that they've done, because that is not something that has happened historically. And particularly in Black neighborhoods that live near these energy companies and these chemical companies, they have felt completely ignored and completely cut out of any of this discussions about what happens to the environment that they directly live in. So I think we really have to ensure that a regulatory agency is a regulatory agency, and that it enforces the laws and the regulations that are in place, and it levies really truly justified and large enough fines to undo the harm that was done. And that is not what we saw most recently. But I think to the other side of that is that we need to do more work to ensure that these problems don't happen, so that these spills do not happen. And one of the things that is a problem throughout a lot of the issues and departments in our government is that when we have laws and regulations on the books, I mean, this is true for labor law, housing law, environmental law, but we don't have nearly enough people who are actually doing the enforcement. So we are relying on corporations to tell us that they are in compliance. And I think we have to instead invest in the upfront enforcement and hire more people to do that work, to do inspections, to ensure that these incredibly catastrophic and potentially deadly catastrophes don't continue to happen. And making sure that we are actually able to get into these corporations and not just simply rely on them self-reporting the state of their plants and the state of their workplaces.
So moving on, how will you work with farmers, particularly in Sussex and Kent County, to ensure that they are using best use practices on their land? And would you consider incentivizing sustainable agriculture?
To the second question, yes, absolutely. I think we need to be looking at entirely different, better ways and different ways to incentivize sustainable agriculture, to incentivize more biodiversity in our agriculture. I think the push toward big ag and sort of monocrop farming has led to a lot of the issues that we see with the way that farming is now done, the chemicals that are used in farming, the way that the land is deteriorated, rather than having crops that support one another, that attract the animals that and insects that can help pollinate, that can help actually treat pests naturally. I think that is absolutely the type of agriculture that we need to get back to, and it should be incentivized by the federal government to focus on building actual food locally throughout the states that can do it. There are, so many of our farms are just making soy and corn, and they're not making food that can actually be fed to the people of Delaware, that can ensure that we have food that doesn't travel incredibly long distances, that we instead are creating more sustainable systems within each state that is able to do it, so that we can feed the people there and feed the people in surrounding states that maybe are not quite able to farm the way that one state may be. So I think we really have to look at farming to feed people and not just farming to create kind of mass products. I would extend this to our poultry industry as well, and the chicken farming, quote unquote, that exists here in our state. We have these mass production plants for both food and chicken that are really harming the environment because of the volume of food that they're creating or product that they're creating, and the methodology that they're using to do it. And when we have these big ag, massive corporation farms, as opposed to family run farms, we see far much damage done to the environment, far more use of chemicals and for both pesticide and insecticide and fertilizer. And then we see a whole lot of runoff into people's land and into people's water. And again, these corporate powers are really capable to use that power to push around regulators. And I think we instead have to have a much more holistic and well-integrated system that is more focused on people who farm to sustain the life of the people that are their neighbors, rather than people who farm to destroy the land and water of their neighbors.
So the salt marshes in lower Delaware are essential to prevent erosion, protect against storm surges, and are ecologically vital habitats for some of Delaware's economically important fishes and crabs. How will you protect these areas?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, that the marshes they absorb a lot of the overflow waters and flood waters that we're going to experience. They're incredibly important. I think we have to make sure that we don't allow any sort of zoning changes or building changes that let people or developers fill them in or build over them. I think we've seen there's a development that's trying to essentially be built over, like on stilts, essentially downstate. And I think we have to be really careful about developing in these areas. They should absolutely be like protected areas and remain so. And I think we need legislation in place, potentially from the federal level, but also on the state level, to ensure that these really sensitive habitats are maintained. And I think we have to change this idea really culturally that every bit of space needs to be developed or every bit of space needs to be built up, because that type of development has led to a lot of the destruction of natural habitats. It has led to a lot of pouring concrete over everything, which takes away a lot of the natural greenery and groundscapes that we need to absorb rainwater and floodwater and all these things. And it reinforces the problem. It's kind of like a two creates the problem, doubles the problem, because that we take away the marsh that can absorb water, and then we put in concrete or hard surfaces that can't absorb any. So yeah, we absolutely need to create legislation that protects these environmental places and habitats.
So this next question kind of follows up on what we were just talking about, but it often seems like it's really easy to encourage people to support conservation when it involves charismatic wildlife like tigers or polar bears, but this can be really difficult on a local scale. Do you have any plans to further wildlife conservation and habitat preservation throughout Delaware, and ways to help people see the inherent value in wildlife and nature?
Yeah, I think that it gets a little bit back to what we were talking about with the windmills, but I think that the work is really important to connect to people how these things affect them, because I think you're right. Like, people see like, oh, Siberian tigers are endangered, and they just sort of like have this maybe natural response of like, oh, we have to protect that. But then when we're talking about frogs or something, that there's something about that type of animal that draws out this emotion in people, versus the animals in their own backyard that are incredibly important. And I think you can actually do a better job of connecting to why that species or that habitat is crucial to their own life. And I think it really comes down to that type of organizing and action and having one-on-one conversations with people, because it is sometimes interesting how people ignore the local in favor of the kind of like national big issue, even though the local issue affects them much more dramatically. So I think what we can be doing there is investing our efforts into communicating specifically, why is this marshland important? Why is this one species important? I mean, when we think about the fact that it's more humid and hotter and we're going to have more mosquitoes, well, it's incredibly important that we have XYZ animals in our habitat to combat that. So finding that way that you can connect it directly to that person's life and explain to them why it's important that we preserve this. I know that that is definitely harder work, but when you have those one-on-one conversations and can kind of see what's important to that individual, usually you can make a more lasting impact to say, this is actually directly affecting my life in XYZ way. And I think that is the effort that needs to go into work like that.
Great. So we're kind of halfway done, and now we're kind of shifting more into like fossil fuels. So a question is, how do you plan to ensure that the people working in fossil fuel-centered industries are able to have a living wage and high quality of life, even when their industries and jobs are likely to be negatively impacted by a rapid shift towards clean energy?
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of touched on this before, but I think a transition plan is incredibly important for a Green New Deal or any legislation that we put forward. Nothing that we should do to protect ourselves should harm workers as a result. I think we absolutely have to do the work to make sure that workers recognize that so they don't stand against that change, because I've even heard that in the work that we've done, where when we're canvassing or calling or texting voters and people who say, well, I work at the oil refinery, like there's this, that kind of like we were just talking about, like there's a more immediate need for them to have that job, to have that income. And when we say that their job might go away, there's a real kind of retreating to the corner and defensiveness that comes out. So it has to be a conversation about how are we going to ensure that people are taken care of. So I support replacing the salaries of oil and fossil fuel industry workers in full until they are able to transition to a new good job. So we cannot just offer people training. We absolutely have to offer them replacements of their salaries to ensure that they do not lose the standard of living and the dignity that they have from that job. I also support a federal jobs guarantee so that anyone who is looking for a job can get one from the federal government. And I support doing the work to help them transition either into renewable energy, if that's where they want to work, or into some other industry, if that's what they're interested in doing, because I think we absolutely have to have the workers in the fossil fuel industry on our side to get through this transition, because we need to help them recognize that they will not be taken care of by the corporations that make money off of the fossil fuel industry. They will be left behind, and shareholders will be taken care of, executives will be taken care of, and they will lose their jobs anyway as fossil fuels decline. So they're much better. We have to talk about how we can ensure that they're much better off through a driven transition rather than a kind of crashing out of the industry.
All right. Because climate change is a global issue, solving it will require an international collaboration. How would you recommend the United States goes forward in regards to joining or leading a global response to climate change?
Yeah, I think that we have to recognize that historically we were a leader in creating this problem. And we have also been a leader in ignoring this problem. And I think we have to now be a leader in recognizing it and taking it seriously and taking responsibility for the damage that we've done. I think that we should welcome the opportunity to lead in developing the technology that we are going to need going forward, whether that's in figuring out how to properly transition our grids and upgrade our energy grids, how to even just properly guarantee workers dignity throughout this transition. Like, this is actually, I would say, an opportunity to kind of own our future and drive it ourselves and set an example for the rest of the world. I think that we have to marry that, though, with America's tendency to try to drive every decision for everyone and try to be imperialistic. And I think we have to instead set the tone for how we are going to manage and take responsibility for the damage that we've done, and do the diplomatic work of trying to bring other countries along as well. But there are countries that are obviously further ahead of us in this. we should not act like there's not things to learn from them. But I think we have to really be honest about taking responsibility for our share of the damage that has been done. And I think we have to think about, when we're talking about developing countries who, yes, maybe are contributing more to climate change right now than we are, we have to think about how we ensure that globally workers and people globally are taken care of, and not cut off workers in other countries from having a dignified standard of living by kind of shutting down the development of their own country.
Thank you. So do you support various market-based solutions to climate change, such as a carbon tax or cap and trade program? So do you think they would be best implemented on a state or national level, or both?
I think when you look at programs like that, trying to institute them on a state level seems potentially flawed, because you'll end up having people kind of move from one state market into another places where if you institute it in Delaware, then people might try to move their business or their use of fossil fuels into a different state. So I think if you're going to use a tool like that, doing it on a state basis is going to be really challenging. I don't inherently oppose things like a carbon tax, but I don't think that they are going to get us where they need to be on their own. And I think the idea that we can simply tax carbon and not do all of the other things that are necessary is really flawed, because taxing carbon doesn't undo the environmental damage that has been done in communities that have been abused by fossil fuel industry, chemical industry, refineries, things like that. So it doesn't take that money, invest it there and to repair harm. It doesn't necessarily actually end any extraction. If anything, it could potentially accelerate it, where people are trying to use as much of the resource that they have and continue to pay to use it, rather than actually stop using it as a whole. So I think while it can be used in conjunction, I think that we absolutely need to also be moving toward ending the use of fossil fuels, because I haven't seen a model where using something like a carbon tax has actually shut down the use of fossil fuels. Instead, it seems to be that a lot of fossil fuel companies are choosing to pay that tax, and sometimes do it in a regressive way where it gets actually put back on the consumer, on the consumption side.
And to follow up with that, what steps, if any, would you take to incentivize the development and production of clean energy and pursuit of carbon neutrality, both in Delaware and nationwide?
So I think we absolutely need to take the subsidies that we are giving to fossil fuel companies and stop giving them to fossil fuel companies, and instead use them to incentivize renewable energy development.
How do you support holding fossil fuel companies responsible for reducing their carbon emissions?
Well, I think, again, I don't think that they should continue to do the work that they're doing. I think we have to shut down fossil fuel extraction and the use of fossil fuels in our grid. So I think the way that you hold them accountable is by making them illegal. I mean, I look at the model of what we did to save the ozone and to ban the chemical products that were causing depletion of the ozone layer. And we did that and stopped that depletion. And that's what we have to do here. We have to take that same level of specific and bold action to stop fossil fuel extraction and usage.
In sort of a similar vein, there are almost certainly going to be more large-scale pollution events in the near future, such as more oil spills. If such an event were to occur, how would you hold the company or the entity accountable? And if so, how?
This kind of gets back to what we were talking about locally with CROTA, right? I think we need enforcement agencies that actually enforce and that levy legitimate fines against these companies, potentially taking away their license to do the work that they're doing if they're doing it in a way that's unsafe. So yes, we absolutely should be moving to a place where we are no longer doing oil extraction. But if we are in the period where that is still happening before we are there, then we need to be much stronger in our response to things like oil spills, things like chemical leaks, because otherwise there's really not a disincentive. If we put fines on companies that they can pay easily without it really causing a bump in the road for them, what is their real reason to ever change any of their protocols or the things that they do? So I think we have to be really serious about either the fines that are levied against them or potentially taking away their license to do the work that they're doing if they can't do if they're doing it in this way that is clearly unsafe.
Awesome. So I know you mentioned this before, actually, about ending fossil fuel subsidies. Could you talk more about this and maybe what you would use the subsidization money for?
Yeah, well, I think that if we're looking to increase investment in renewable energy, in public transportation, in getting emissions out of our transportation system, those are all things that we could be supporting and incentivizing and investing in. I think the federal government needs to take seriously the level of investment that it makes into these programs that will end our dependence on fossil fuels. So not only changing out the source of energy to renewables, but we need to be looking at investing in on the consumer side and consumption side of what do our buildings look like and how are they constructed and how is energy consumption inside of them. Same thing goes for transportation system. Do we have electric buses and trains and things that are running on zero emissions? How do we invest in those things? Like those are all of the things that our federal government should absolutely be putting our public money and resources behind.
One of the major issues preventing the advancement of green policies in Washington is the refusal of certain politicians to acknowledge the existence of man-made climate change. What would your approach be to working with these politicians?
I think we have to replace them. I mean, I really don't think that we should be compromising on something that is an existential crisis. I think we have to do the work to get those people out of office because they are doing real harm to their constituents and our country. So instead of looking at ways that we can compromise and work with those people, I'm going to look at ways that we can actually replace them with someone who's going to do right by the working people of their state or their district and our country.
So this is our last question for the evening. Last year, Governor Carney signed legislation to ban plastic bags in the state of Delaware. How will you continue this effort to move away from single-use plastics to alternatives?
Yeah, I think that we have to address this on the manufacturing side and the kind of supply side, not just on the consumer side, right? I think that kind of gets back to like individual actions can help, but they're not going to be the final solution. So we have made decisions before to no longer sell products that were harmful to people. We should be doing that when it comes to single-use plastics. Like we should absolutely be moving away from, I mean, the thing that gets me are like bottled water, like that one in particular. Like we can absolutely take the steps to say these can no longer be plastic products and find another way to deliver those products. But it's going to take getting people elected that care about kind of taking that step and doing that work.
All right, so that concludes our questions for the evening. So Jess, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I really just appreciate you all for giving me the time to answer these questions. You know, I'm running for office because we are a country facing quite a few crises, and climate change is certainly one of them, but wealth inequality and public health and racial injustice are certainly others. And I really think we're at a place where we cannot accept the status quo. And we have had leaders my entire lifetime who have really only nibbled around the edges of change. And it's led to a government that is failing to adequately support its people and take seriously the problems that we are facing. So Delaware and our country, we really need more leaders who are focused on solving the root causes of these issues. And that is what I hope to do as your senator.
Well, thanks again for joining us. We'll send you a link to this discussion after we post it. And yeah, thanks EOEC for joining us as well, and everyone else. Yeah. All right, so have
Thank
a
you.
good evening.
Well, you take care.